sideboarding in between games of a best-of-3 is an important skill for competitive Riftbound players, so that's what we'll be talking about today in this installment of Riftbound Fundamentals, a series in which I explain core strategic card game concepts behind effective Riftbound play. I'm Simon from Games Deconstructed, and let's get started! There's two components to sideboarding. The first is how to tactically apply it during matches, which cards you pull out and which cards you put in, and the other is building a strategic sideboard plan before an event, making the decision of which 8 cards you want to bring to a tournament. We'll start with the in-game part, how to make decisions about replacing cards in your deck mid-match and by what mechanisms that influences your win rate. Once we have an understanding of that, we'll move on to building sideboards that maximize these possibilities. Now, the number one most obvious example of sideboard impact is silver bullets. Those are cards with a high individual impact against a specific strategy or small group of strategies, but a far lower one against others. Gear Hate against Aurora is a good example. When played in the main deck, there's certain matchups where these Gear Hate cards will have no targets whatsoever, becoming dead draws. There's some matchups where they might have some targets, but not especially exciting ones. But played against Aurora or dedicated equipment strategies, you'll always be glad to see them in your hand. There is a large power differential between these possible scenarios. So by putting them in the sideboard, you ensure that you'll only see them in games where they are worthwhile. Now, in certain situations, you might see people splashing 1 or perhaps 2 of these silver bullets in the main board, to increase their chances in game 1 of a series against the decks that they counter. That is something that's easier to accomplish for decks that draw a lot of cards overall, minimizing the impact of a potential single dead draw, or decks that filter through cards a lot, have a lot of card selection. For example, in Diana, you can always pitch a dead turn to dust to Hui's effect, if need be. In cases like this, if your silver bullets are included in the main deck as a hedge against their werewolf decks game 1, they are the first candidates to be sided out in games 2 and 3 against strategies where they are not especially useful. It's kind of an inversion of the norm here. Instead of pulling them in when you're sure they matter, you pull them out when you're sure they don't. Which of the two is going to be better is very much a metagame call. How important you find them in game 1s where they matter, how often they are fully dead, and so on and so forth. It's a case-by-case basis decision. Now, this being the most obvious and arguably the most attention-grabbing part of a sideboard plan, because it feels good to include cards that are potentially game-winning, I find its impact to be a little bit overemphasized. Because there's a number of other purposes to also be accomplished while sideboarding. Crucially, you're making 2 decisions in the sideboarding process, not 1. You decide which cards to bring in, that might be silver bullets, but equally as important is which cards you take out. And these are 2 decisions of equal importance. I know that this might sound like a truism, but I often find beginner players, and help even myself, concentrating on what cards they want to bring in, with the cards that they take out being a bit of an afterthought. And that very much shouldn't be the case. Let's take an example where our decision on what to side would clearly be motivated by wanting to get rid of certain cards. We're playing Victor, and our deck plays 3 times Call the Week, perhaps even 3 times Safety Inspector in the main. It's not the case of Call the Week being a mainboard silver bullet, because it's an all-rounder excellent card in like 80% of our matchups. But there are ones where we play against swarm decks, the Mirror, Azir, Lilia, in which those cards become recognizably weaker. Sure, there's still opportunities to play them, but you'll have to work harder to set them up, and seeing 2 of those cards in your hand might very well mean you'll lose the game. In a situation like this, it's very natural for the process of sideboarding to start from a place of, how do I get rid of these suddenly bad cards? And you'll go looking for replacements in your side deck. And this is especially going to be the case against decks that approach the game on a fully different axis. The Aurora matchup might be one, but let's say we're playing Master Yi and we are facing Infinite Loop Lux. That deck doesn't especially fight for the board at pretty much any point of the game apart from maybe the final turn. So most of our combat tricks don't matter in the slightest here. In sideboarding, the main goal in the matchup is going to be to get rid of these cards to increase our overall draw quality. We might put in our disarming rakes, not for the effect, but just because drawing into a unit, any unit, will be better than finding an on guard on top of our deck. So it's a yin and yang style deal. Sideboarding is comprised of the two decisions of which cards you wanna bring in and which cards you wanna take out, and depending on the matchup and the deck you're playing, one or the other might contribute more to your chances of winning the follow-up games of a best of 3. The extremes on this axis are silver bullet cards on one end of it, and pulling out generalist good cards because your opponent is playing some weird stuff that makes them useless on the other. Whereas most of your sideboarding decisions will live somewhere in the middle of the two. You'll be pulling out somewhat worse cards that don't work as well in the matchup, and pulling in slightly better ones from the sideboard. But what's good and what's bad in the matchup is not the only thing that can shape your sideboarding decisions. Perhaps you've seen certain sideboards, like this top Lilia deck from Vancouver by Galewinds, playing a singular, non-situational 2-drop in the side. The intent is to side it in when you 100% know when you're going first, in games 2 or 3. Since Lilia runs a 3-cost Chosen Champion, she's never going to miss out on a turn 1 play going second. There's a 50% chance of the Lilia player going second game 1, where she's gonna have a 100% guarantee of having something to play on turn 1, and a 50% chance of her going first, where she's gonna have a 65% chance of fighting a 2-cost unit without a power cost associated, and 92% of having something to play turn 1, including masks and fountains, which are notably worse options but still playable. The 50% chance of having that guaranteed Lilia play drops the chances of missing your turn 1 drop to just about 17.5%, assuming you don't want to play masks or fountains. Adding that extra poro in games where you're 100% going first increases your chances of seeing a 2-drop unit, one of the ones that you'd like to see, from 65% to 72.2%. And of seeing anything with a 2 in the energy section from 92 to 94.4%. So if you can afford it in terms of the availability of your sideboard slots, having an extra turn 1 play to lower your chances of turn 1 passing, which is a very sad feeling, by a couple percentage points even, is always an option worth exploring. On the other hand, if your deck has a lot of playable 3-drops, maybe even a 3-drop Chosen Champion, you might want to side out a 2-drop when you know you'll be going second, especially if you have more ideas on what to put in over what you want to pull out. If there's suddenly 13 playables on turn 1 with 3 energy or lower in its cost, pulling out one of them is not really going to change that much, so you can probably afford it. And the extra card pulled in from the sideboard, or even the increased draw quality brought upon by having one less Pookie to top deck in the late game, might have a larger overall impact. And if you want to learn more about how your 2-drop count influences your chances of seeing one in the opening hand, I have a video just about that. You can open it up for later using the card on screen right now. There might also be cards that go in and out of your main deck depending on your battlefield selection. Treasure Hoard plus Pickpocket combo in Victor is one example. Pickpockets are super useful against decks playing cheap equipment, notably Azir, decent against decks that reliably generate gold tokens, and mostly unexciting against decks that do neither. But if your battlefield choice game 1 is Treasure Hoard, it ensures your opponent will likely generate that gold at least sometimes, and you'll find a target for the Pickpockets effect. So the synergy with the battlefield makes you a better user of the locations effect, because you'll actually get to keep yours while your opponent will occasionally have their gold destroyed, and simultaneously it makes Pickpockets a less situational unit. They will be excellent in a game 1 versus an Azir, but they will be at least okay against other decks that they would have kind of sucked against otherwise. And if you're in a matchup where they are useful without the Treasure Hoard in play, you will keep them in for game 2. If not, you have a prime candidate to take out for whatever works better from the cards in your sideboard than a, vanilla 3-for-3 unit. Finally, you might see a split of cards like 2 of a certain card in the main deck, 1 in the side deck, or perhaps for some of the more expensive ones, a 1 here, 1 here. The shorthand that I follow for this is having 3 copies of a card in a deck is for cards that you don't mind seeing more than 1 of, or when you absolutely need to find at least 1, ideally early in the game. 2 copies is for cards that you wanna find 1 of, but it's not the end of the world if you miss it, or if it happens later in the game. And 1 is for cards where you don't especially care about finding them. They might be okay if you do, they might be okay if you don't. Now that we know what mechanisms the sideboarding process utilizes to influence our win rates, we can move on to building a sideboard plan, something that you'll want to do before an event. But before we do, I'd like to plug something I made, which is a Riftbound achievement tracking website. Whenever you accomplish something impressive or fun in a game of Riftbound, like winning with Gutter Palace or going lossless in a skirmish, you can head to the site and get a little dopamine boost. It's purely a for fun project, fully free, all the data stored locally on your end without any tracking. You can find a link in the description and the pinned comment if you wanna check it out. Now, back to the video. Deciding which cards go into your sideboard is probably going to happen towards the tail end of the deck building process. It should definitely be preceded by deciding on the core of your deck. Cards that will most likely stay in your main deck for the majority of matchups, and where you're pretty clear on the quantities that you wanna play. Having that out of the way, you will be left with a couple flex slots in your main board and 8 cards to put in the sideboard. The number of flex slots will vary from deck to deck. Some decks can't really afford to run too many cards that don't contribute to the core game plan, while others might be so-called toolboxes. So after you have that core, I'd go look at the meta. Since your sideboard and to a degree the flex slots in your main deck will help you address specific problems, it's good to know what specific problems you might expect. And there's a couple options on that front. First off, you can head to a website like riftdex.com, which aggregates tournament results and paints a generalized, data-driven picture of the meta, or you can head to riftmeta.net, which is updated by the excellent Riftbound content creator Lothar HS, based on his experience. Finally, the best approach is going to be gathering data about the expected meta of the event you plan on attending. If it's a local skirmish, a lot of folks will be playing what they've been playing at Nexus Night level throughout the season. And there will often be cases of certain decks or deck archetypes being more popular at the local level than globally, or the other way around. So it's always going to be more useful to know what people might be playing at the event you plan on attending. Based on whichever combination of these methods you apply, I want you to choose up to 5 or 6 matchups that will guide your flex slot and sideboarding choices. These should be against decks that are both powerful and popular from your perspective. For each of them, you'll want to consider how the core of your deck fares against the core of their deck. You can use matchup matrices for this, but I find that they ignore a lot of differences between variants of the same deck, like Hook versus non-Hook LeBlanc, and they often have a low sample size to the point of irrelevance in certain matchups, so your mileage may vary for this. Now, out of the pool of cards that you deem playable in your colors, attempt to find winners and losers for each of these matchups. If you think seeing a card in your hand when facing LeBlanc increases your odds of winning, it's a winner. If you will mentally groan when drawing it, it's a loser. A lot of cards will be middle of the road, so keep that in mind as well. Once you have that, it's time to decide which cards from your list of winners are flex slots and which are sideboard inclusions. And this is kind of an optimization puzzle. Flex slots in the main apply the most to your odds in game 1 of a series. So if a card improves that immensely, but it's possible that the opponent might answer it post-sideboard, it probably goes in the main deck and will be sideboarded out as needed. Beyond that, a common sense approach is to main deck cards that are applicable more broadly, okay against a lot of matchups, while cards that are winners in some but losers in others, more of the silver bullet variety, go in the sideboard. But as we've mentioned previously, there are decks that might afford a silver bullet in the main, especially if it's not just targeting a single deck but like 2 or 3 of them. So for each of these slots, you'll have to perform the mental math of whether you value a card that's game-winning in a single matchup, okay in 3, atrocious in 1, more highly than a card that's kinda good in 4 of them and meh in 2. Then you can consider what cards you might want more or less copies of when going first or second. These are prime candidates for the side deck if you want the option of adding them in one of these situations, or for the main deck if you want the option of removing them in one of these situations. Fair warning, you will probably end up with more candidate cards than you have flex and sideboard slots for. With flex slots, you run the risk of your deck becoming unreliable if you include too many of them. Riftbound deck size is rather limited to begin with, so there is going to be limits on how many flex cards you can include. For side decks, a lot of pro players have been bemoaning the fact that we only have 8 slots available, since it doesn't allow you to pack that special card for every single matchup in the meta, especially when metas are as open and unsolved as the current Unleashed one is. Therefore, you might have to self-edit which cards you might want to include in your side deck pretty radically, but hey, them's the breaks, we all face those decisions. I hope this video taught you a little bit about sideboard strategies. Make sure to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more guides like this, and let me know in the comments what's one aspect of the game that you'd most like to improve at. I've been Simon from Games Deconstructed, thanks a lot for watching, and a special thank you to the Patreon supporters over at patreon.com/gamesdeconstructed, especially John, Piotr Michalak, and Zofia Cywoniuk. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.